Okay, hello again and welcome. That's me. Hi everyone and welcome. That's me on the first slide here. I am the Senior Program Director at Primary Source. I have been here at the organization for the past 10 years, but prior to that I studied Chinese history as an undergraduate and lived in China for a year and came back, and I was a high school teacher in Acton-Boxborough Regional High School. And I was lucky enough to be able to teach both world history and an independent study on modern Chinese history. So some of what you'll hear today draws upon that experience, but a lot of it draws upon my time in the last decade, really, working with teachers, designing courses on Chinese history, and creating a book of all of the resources that I wish I had had when I was a classroom teacher. So I hope to treat you to some of those as we go along through this webinar. I'm sure many of you, and I can see from the chat box that many of you are world history teachers, I'm sure you've given lots of thought to why primary sources are a good thing to bring into your classroom. I just added a few here to stimulate your thinking prior to showing you some primary sources from China itself. And I like to use primary sources in teaching about China because they hook kids in because they're vivid. They really speak in the voice of the culture that you're studying, which I think is extremely important. And they have a kind of life to them. You can kind of see the fingerprints, you can see the history in the making. And that's very important for conveying a sense of the past and a sense that people weren't just like us, that they had their own worldviews and ways of thinking. I think primary sources add nuance and complexity to whatever else students might be reading as a secondary text, and they help kids see that not everyone from a culture or a time period thought the same. And they really allow us to bring the Chinese into the teaching of China. You know, there isn't really anything like what you can access when you're reading a 19th century text about someone trying to fight the influx of opium into the culture. This is the kind of voice that I think really makes history feel more real. The other set of reasons for teaching with primary sources is to engage the students and let them see what historians normally get to do, which is to encounter the raw materials, read some of the secondary materials, and begin to create interpretations, to let them see that part of what we think history is what we figure out from examining texts or examining images or whatever it is. So that's motivating to be able to have a chance to interpret. And of course it really forces them to practice their historical thinking skills of analyzing, of employing historical empathy, of corroborating things that they see in one text but they're not sure others saw, or whether things really happen that way, and synthesizing the insights of different sources into a kind of narrative. So those, I think, are some of the primary reasons that bringing primary sources into the study of China, or really any culture, is important. When people study creative writing, a common piece of advice that they're given is show, don't tell. And I was thinking about this as I prepared for the webinar. I think history teachers might need a slightly adapted version of that, which is show and let the students tell, or show and tell them later after they've had a chance to try to figure things out for themselves. So I like this bit of Chinese calligraphy as a kind of hook. It's a neat way, you know, to hand something like this to students or project something like this for students and say, what kind of person do you think would have created a scroll of calligraphy like this? And just to give them a moment, or take a moment yourself to think about that question, what is this material? Does anyone have any thoughts that they want to type quickly into the chat box? Who would have created something like this scroll? It is perfectly fine to guess. Elites. Yes, great guess. Absolutely. And in this case, it was the elite of the elite. This is actually a scroll by the Emperor Qianlong, which was printed on special gold paper made just for the emperor. And the reason I like it as a teaching tool is that it hooks kids into what some of the key values of Chinese culture were. The fact that a scholar official was expected to be literate, that some of them were in fact very accomplished artists like Qianlong with his calligraphy, that they had a notion of scholarship. Here you see him at a desk with an inkstone and a scroll paper and his pen in hand, looking oh so happy to begin creating a work of art. That this tradition in China was one that was much respected and valued, and the emphasis on being accomplished in these ways is a part of the culture that was important in the Qing dynasty, but even before that period of time. So that gets kids thinking, and you could hand them either one of these images and say, what do these tell us about Chinese culture? Or you could tell a different and much more modern story by giving them photographs such as these. These are images of the quotations of Chairman Mao Zedong, also known as the Little Red Book, that was so common in the 1960s and 1970s during the Cultural Revolution. And you can pair that with a text or with an image such as the one at the right, which is a bonfire of Buddhas. And these are the things you can see the fingerprints almost on the Little Red Book. You can almost smell the burning of these sacred icons of Buddhism. And they really began by forcing kids to ask questions about, what is this? Why so many little books that were the same? Why bonfires where they burned up their cultural heritage? That's the kind of curiosity I think that is helpful going into a study of modern China. This is the cover of Primary Sources' new source book for teachers and for students. It's called China Since 1644, A History Through Primary Sources. And really what it represents is the work of many, many teachers and scholars over really 15 years of teaching about China and trying to collect what they felt was best and most teachable for secondary classrooms. So this is the product of a lot of hunting and gathering of sources, and then pairing those primary sources with background texts and activities and supplemental resources that are meant to provide the background and give people confidence to bring them into the classroom feeling like they really understand what's in those sources. So I see this basically as the ultimate time-saving tool for any teacher who wants to teach about China since about the period of 1644, although the book actually has one chapter about the Ming Dynasty, so it goes back even a little bit earlier than that in time. What will we do in this webinar? I'm going to give you a tour of some of the sorts of primary sources that you can find in the book, and then we'll talk a little bit about ways to use them, both alone and together, what the different elements within this book are that are meant to support them, and I think whether or not you happen to be using this book, I think those are elements that are important to think about when you introduce primary sources into the classroom. And we'll talk about how teaching globally with Chinese sources links to some of the Common Core state standards very briefly. And finally, I'll use the Cultural Revolution as an example of how you can juxtapose sources to get kids thinking in new ways about events that were complex and really are hard to understand without the infusion of multiple perspectives. So that is the plan. This book, which I see as a one-stop shop if you teach about China from the Qing Dynasty to the present, really, there's some features of it that I want you to know about because they're important. It's a chronologically organized text, and it is written both for teachers and for direct use with students. So the voice of the book addresses students. If you are teaching a course on Chinese history, it could be a class text that you might decide to use with your students. It really addresses both history, geography, art, literature, sort of anything that might illuminate topics of importance and teachability in middle and high school classrooms. Okay, moving right along. The next part of this is meant to be very visual and help you to see what kinds of content you will find inside of this particular book, but the kinds of content that I think in general are really helpful to bring into your classrooms. There are slideshows of all different aspects of life and thinking in China. This happens to be one from the Ming Dynasty chapter, introducing 16th century China through a portrait of Chinese gardens and the different elements within them. Here's element 4, architecture. But there are also slideshows that are meant to be like a little virtual tour. This slideshow is called Duolun Road from Shanghai. It's a statue of the renowned writer Ling, who wrote short stories during the 1920s and 1930s. And on this particular street of Shanghai, she is joined by statues of many other eminent literary figures and kind of thought leaders of that period. And there is also the Teahouse where they gathered, and a museum to the movement. So it takes you through those key figures in a way that the students who may never go to China can get a sense of what the pride that the Chinese have in these writers and in that movement. There are also, I should mention, just going back for 1 second, there are also videos embedded in some of the chapters. For example, there are video clips taken by a man from Ohio that show Shanghai in the 1930s in all of its kind of cosmopolitan glory. There are many sources in this book that I would never have known existed, and I think that is where the benefit is from drawing on so many different people's searching for great materials over the years. There are things like this calendar from a book called The Description of the Scenery of the Imperial Capital, and it's just a calendar saying what the different festival-related activities are that really, I think, illuminates what was important and valuable to the Chinese in the capital. Everything from the most mundane kinds of details about airing their books and their clothing to bathing the imperial elephants in the moat. Who even knew that there were imperial elephants? I think as taken as a larger source, and this is just one little piece of it, but the whole source is about 2 pages long. It could make a wonderful starting point for thinking about what Chinese people valued in the 17th century and which holidays, still are very important in China. This is a good time, I think, to note that there is a companion website that goes with the China source book that has the complete text of all the sources, and it allows primary source to update things and add things to the later chapters and make sure all the links are working and really make it a kind of dynamic resource for teachers as opposed to a static one. Other kinds of sources you might find might be sacred edicts of the emperor. You might find merchants' requests for things from the government and the responses of officials to those requests. The tables of contents of famous magazines from early 20th century movements, surveys of Chinese opinion on different topics. These kind of primary sources that you might assume are out there, but they're hard to search for because you don't really know what the search terms would be. I think one strength of the book is that it collects these things for you. Here is a famous letter from Lin Zexu to Queen Victoria, 1839. We know the British were heavily engaged in the exportation of opium from India to China, but how much do we know about what the Chinese thought about it? Well, there are actually fantastic sources that tell us what the Chinese thought about that. And although I don't think this letter actually made it to the hands of Queen Victoria, it is the ultimate sort of source showing Chinese pride and the offense they took at British trade policies. So I'll just give you a second to look at that. It's just a small piece of the letter. I particularly love this sentence. Since it is not permitted to do harm to your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to the harm of other countries. How much less to China? There, the centrality, this notion of the Middle Kingdom really comes through loud and clear, and the sense of being wronged that he has when the Chinese are only exporting beneficial goods and the British are sending opium back in return because that's one thing they found that the Chinese actually want from them. So it's a wonderful kind of letter. So letters are an important kind of text for students to get used to exploring, as are artworks. This is a woodblock print from the 1930s in the communist encampment at Yan'an, where they remained for many years during the Chinese Civil War, trying to take power from Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. But it's an interesting print of a study session that I think captures some of both the idealism and the revolutionary fervor, as well as the physical landscape of a part of China where people actually carved their homes and dormitories into the sides of caves. It's a very unusual physical landscape of China, so beautifully captured in this evocative woodblock print. There's poetry. This is an excerpt from a poem by Ai Qing, who is the father of Ai Weiwei, if you've ever heard of the sort of artist and dissident Ai Weiwei, who has made such moving sort of memorials to children killed in the earthquake in China, and really many other political topics. His dad was a very famous poet, and this was a poem from that really difficult period of Chinese history when the parties were at war with each other and then at war with the Japanese at the same time. And I think it's just a very powerful way to see the way the Chinese people felt about conditions. Moving along, excerpts from plays are included in the book. This is a delightful play called Teahouse by the author Lao She. This is from Act 2. I'm really not concerned that you read every word of this, because these are meant as illustrations of the kind of primary sources that might work well in your classrooms. And I'm sure you can immediately envision how, a dramatic script, even a piece of a dramatic script, might be fun, either for students to view because there is a video of this play, or to enact, to assign students parts and have them do a dramatic rendition of it in the classroom, followed by some analysis of what's going on. So there's a great passage in this one little clip about, Fourth Elder Chang getting out of prison, joining the Boxers. He talks about being a Qing bannerman, which meant that he was in a kind of military unit, and how he has coped since the end of the Qing dynasty and the end of the bannermen. And I love the ending of this piece where he asks how his friends who are reunited at the tea house have been doing, and Wu Shangzi says, "We muddle along. When there was an emperor, we served the emperor. When Yuan Shikai became president, we served President Yuan Shikai. And now, Song and Zi, how would you put it?" Song and Zi says, "Now we serve whoever puts food in our bellies." And of course, there are the sorts of documents, apart from poetry, literature, memoirs, diaries, and short stories, all the kind of creative genres, there are more political documents like manifestos, speeches, and reports that are represented, and I think are wonderful informational texts to draw upon when you teach about modern China. Here's just a little clip from the Manifesto of the PLA, written by Mao himself in 1947. So this is before the communists had fully captured the country. And they're telling people, this is what we stand for. This is what the policies of our army are. It's not a government. It's just an army at this point in time. But we're about uniting everyone. We're about establishing a democratic coalition. We want to punish the Civil War criminals headed by Chiang Kai-shek. There's a lot about freedom of speech in the press and of assembly. I think this is the kind of document that really would have the power to surprise students and make them think hard about what the appeal of the Communist Party was and the PLA was to people who had been through years at that point of civil war. So it might be the sort of text that you could pair with a source or a speech by Mao from a decade later or a decade after that, and look at the ways that the sort of ideals on paper of the party shifted over time. Political posters and propaganda are also wonderful kinds of primary sources to introduce to students. Sometimes they can be paired with other images in a kind of gallery or poster form where kids can compare what each has to say about an event or a climate. This particular one is from the Great Leap Forward, which began in 1959 and went until about 1962. It was the period of time when the Chinese divided, after a bumper crop in 1958, the party was inspired to divide people up. Pretty much 99% of rural people were divided up and put into people's communes. And given very high production targets, the notion was to really mobilize the masses to produce agriculturally in order to support the development, the very rapid development of industry, and catch up to other countries. So you got a lot of this kind of image. The commune is like a gigantic dragon. Production is visibly awe-inspiring. I think students would really be able to say a lot about what this kind of poster was meant to achieve. You know, they tend to be fairly savvy about propaganda and, you know, probably much more savvy than Chinese in the 1950s when it was a fairly new art form. You could take a text like that and put it next to statistics about the Great Leap Forward, what the production targets were, how much they were fulfilled, and the kinds of famine that resulted from too much grain being projected and then taken out of the countryside, leading to the deaths of, it's hard to say an exact number. Scholars say everything from 20 million people to 45 million Chinese people, of whom children were the most heavily affected category. So that is the beginning of a conversation that is, I think, a very rich one to have, sort of image and reality and the traumatic consequences when the two diverge in the name of ideology. Here is just a couple of clips from diplomatic agreements between China and the U.S. There are several chapters in our source book that deal with China's foreign relations, and the U.S. figures in those chapters in major ways, in topics ranging from ping-pong diplomacy to what, how the U.S. regarded Taiwan, which are both addressed in the famous Shanghai Communiqué of 1972 that President Nixon helped to broker. So there are, with all the other kinds of sources, I wanted to make clear that there are many sort of official sources that can be very enlightening towards students. And this one was a real breakthrough because it was about normalizing relations between two countries with very different political viewpoints. And there's a lot of journalism. And journalistic sources are wonderful to use. You can access sources from China Daily or the Beijing Review or party newspapers like Jianhua. There's really a lot out there that you can explore with students, and you can talk about, what do party sources have to say on a topic? What do sources from the West have to say on the same topic? How is China presented in the mainstream media in the West? How do these things diverge? Or you can just use them to introduce topics like the incredibly rapid growth of China's economy, and that is what this particular source is about. This one is from 2005, but it's easy to find things that go up to, today and yesterday, and you can, as you get familiar with some of those sources in translation, China Daily, we just posted a link for people following the chat room. You can bring in sources on all kinds of topics that will really make your course cutting edge and give it a feel of relevance to kids wanting to understand the China that they'll be getting to know in the world they'll be living in. Okay, there is one chapter in our source book that deals with growing up in China. And I just had to include this image. It's just a piece of a whole guide to the kinds of eye exercises that the Chinese believe are very important to do in schooling, particularly in elementary and middle, but it's a part of the culture and the school culture that extends beyond that. So if any of you are getting tired of staring at this bright screen and need to take a moment to massage your inner eyebrows at the heavenly accord point, please feel free to try that out. I don't know if we'll have time for a total of 64 turnings going in both directions, but this would be the kind of exercise that would be part of the culture of schooling in China. And there are more serious, you might say, aspects of that chapter that talk about the education of urban children and rural children, what they do for fun, how they face the high-stakes exams that determine where they go to college and what professions they'll have the capacity to enter. So there's a lot. There's a lot about popular culture that students will find resonant and interesting. So that's one feature of the book that was done specially for teachers. Okay, often people think that because the name of our organization is Primary Source, that we endorse primary sources above all other kinds of resources, and that's a little misleading. We love primary sources, but we really think they work best and most effectively when paired with other kinds of information, and we've made it a point to try to provide those things. And I think those are things that are important however you're bringing primary sources into your classroom. So, you know, pairing with resources for further learning, pairing primary sources with biographical details, pairing them with important vocabulary terms that will make sources decipherable, and of course with historical background essays that are accessible to students and teachers. So I wanted to just bring you into the China Sourcebook and show you what those kinds of things look like for people who might be interested in the resource. This is what it is. This is Chapter 16, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. Here we're really into the 1980s and what socialism was beginning to mean then. And, you know, for those of you who are familiar with the Common Core state standards, you probably know that one of the standards for social studies or literacy in history and social studies involves tracing the development of a concept over time. I forget the number of the standard, but it's basically tracing an idea over time. And socialism is a really interesting one in modern Chinese history to do that with. What did socialism mean? You know, in the early years it was used. What did it mean to the Communist Party when they were out of power, and then when they were in power, and then when Mao died and Deng Xiaoping took over power? Deng certainly had a different understanding of that. So one of the activities that we've devised to go with this is to just take quotations, which are a kind of primary source. So quotations from Karl Marx, quotations from Deng Xiaoping, and quotations from Mao Zedong, and pair them to see what their different notions of socialism are. And it's fascinating because you swiftly find out that they used the term in very different ways, and that the term evolved in the popular understanding over time. So you can see the contents of this chapter and the key idea. And then the bottom of that page looks like this. It has guiding questions for the chapter, terms to know, and there is a glossary at the end of the book that defines all of these for a Chinese context, so that students can you know, read with a guide essentially. This is a piece of the background essay. I'm really just taking you on a flying tour so that you can see the kinds of tools that are very helpful. Now there are, of course, many historian texts and trade books. There are other source books. They tend to be designed for university level that can provide background pieces But this one is one really meant to focus on the topics that would be most teachable in a secondary classroom. It's really designed with teachers, by teachers, for teachers. This is what the documents look like within the source book. This happens to be a piece of a very extensive newspaper correspondence from the 1980s where Chinese students at some Beijing university initiated a conversation about what is the meaning of life and how did they sort of capture the disillusionment that they felt through all these years of ideological change and promises. And there were 57,000 letters to the editor that resulted from this correspondence. Really just, I mean, China does have a large population, but that is just an extraordinary kind of response. It clearly hit a nerve. It hit a kind of seeking for meaning that was happening in China in the 1980s as they redefined their path in the post-cultural revolution years. So we give you a little piece of it here, and then the companion website has a larger amount of the text, the full text. Here's what an activity looks like. I just picked one random activity, which happens to be a writing activity. There are many reading-based activities and speaking and listening-based activities in the source book, but this is, one involving composing a dialogue or role-playing a dialogue, and one that's more of an essay composition idea that draws upon the sources. And all of the activities draw upon sources provided in the book. This lovely picture, I shouldn't have put the names of the guys on and seen if you could guess any of them. I actually don't know who the guy peeking out in the background is, but this is a famous picture of Zhou Enlai, Mao Zedong, and Gu from the 1930s. I think it's from the Yan'an period that you saw in the woodblock print. And I show it to you in order to make this activity a little bit more comprehensible. This is actually from a different chapter than the Socialism with Chinese Characteristics chapter. But you can see the kinds of questions that we've provided for you to, start students on a photographic exploration. So sometimes the activities get very detailed and suggest actual questions like this. Sometimes they are written more at the level of compose an essay about, and you would kind of take it from there as the teacher. And sometimes guiding questions for particular sources are provided as supplemental resources in a chapter. This is almost every chapter has at least one biographical portrait or a closer look about a topic in greater depth. So there might be a closer look about the Dalai Lama. There might be a closer look about the Feng sisters, Madame Chiang Kai-shek and her two sisters. Or there might be one about a topic like opium and opium smoking. Each chapter has at least one and up to 3 of these that allow students to kind of delve in a little bit on some of the really fascinating topics of Chinese history. And finally, here is what the beginning of every chapter looks like. There's a listing of the primary sources. You can kind of see the range of, this is the last chapter of the book. It's the most contemporary chapter, and it ranges from journalistic sources from the West, journalistic sources from China, an excerpt from Oracle Bones by Peter Hessler. There are many others after that. But this chapter has many supplementary materials as well, which range from questions to essays on different minority areas, different things that support activities in the book. So that's a look in the book. I think that's enough in terms of the tour. And in order to preserve time for questions, I quickly want to go through this last piece, which is to connect the teaching of modern China to the era we're in right now, which is the Common Core era, at least for the 45 states that have adopted it. And you probably know already that the Common Core requires students to grapple with works whose craft and thought ranges across genres, cultures, and centuries. So while the standards themselves don't have that much language about global texts or global information, the motivating spirit of the Common Core standards is expecting students to have access to these kinds of sources, and I'm sure that there will be global sources that will turn up on the assessment tests when they roll out in the next year. So we see the teaching of China as very compatible with what the Common Core is doing, since it asks students to look at arguments and provide evidence for those arguments from complex informational texts. And by informational text, the Common Core does not just mean written prose texts, like a governmental report or an NGO document. They actually take quite a broad definition of informational text that ranges from charts to visual evidence to, creative works that shed light on something. Actually, creative works probably wouldn't be considered informational text, but something like a memoir would, which recounts, incidents that happened in someone's life. So think broadly about what informational text means, and then think about ways that they can be put next to each other to ask students to engage with their contents. Doing close readings where kids are asked questions or develop questions that involve looking carefully at what authors say, how they back it up, what the tone is, how the whole document is crafted is a very important part of the core. And so are doing little research projects, not necessarily that junior research paper, but regularly looking into topics and writing about what they are learning and why they think a certain thing is credible. I've heard this described as reading like a detective and writing like an investigative reporter. If students can do those things, they'll be in great shape. And so lastly, the notion that teaching from a textbook is really not going to get students to develop the sort of skills the Common Core requires comes through loud and clear. So it's about how you cluster sources or pair sources, and I just cited a couple of the grade 9 to 10 reading standards for history that directly hit that right on the nose. Looking at points of view, comparing and contrasting treatments of the same topic in several primary and secondary sources. So I think, these standards look very simple in the way that they're written, but they ask a whole lot of teachers in terms of how you actually prepare to teach that way. To find sources that are dynamic and speak to one another is not a quick task. It takes often years to develop the sources that really work well together. And that's where I think, primary sources tried to do that in this book. We've tried to pair those sources and find those sources and provide a resource that saves teachers a whole lot of time. So my last example is just about the Cultural Revolution. I don't want to spend more than 3 or 4 minutes on this, and we'll leave the last 15 minutes for questions. But I think the Cultural Revolution is a topic that's often taught on modern China. Sometimes it's taught in comparison with the French Revolution or the American Revolution as a study about revolutions. And sometimes it's taught as a sort of an iconic period of Chinese history, one that was so full of revolutionary fervor and change that it took the rest of the world, the rest of the world was really shocked by what happened. So it's an engaging one, partly because students, young people, were primary actors in it, and in that sense, I think it's a fascinating one for teenagers or preteens to engage in. How do primary sources help us teach the Cultural Revolution in a nuanced way? It is a complex set of events, and the events themselves are fairly contradictory. So how can we marshal primary sources to help us tell a story that isn't just the kids gone wild story? That is not, bonfires and little red books and people running off to the countryside to be educated amongst the peasants. Who benefited from the Cultural Revolution? Why did it have so much appeal? Why is there nostalgia about it in China today in many sectors? These are really important questions that suggest there was a lot going on there that we need to understand better. So I've just included a few of the documents from our Cultural Revolution chapter that give some insight, I think, into how you begin to help kids see how much was happening and who it was happening with. This is a middle school document created by the Red Guards at the number 26 Middle School of Beijing in 1966. This is early in the revolution, a revolution that was essentially kicked off by Chairman Mao as a way to sort of define the future path of the communist revolution in his own terms and prevent the kind of revisionism that was happening in the Soviet Union, where elites were sort of taking it over. So these kids created a list of 100 instructions for carrying out the revolution within their school, the Maoism school, as it was renamed. And it's so interesting to read these, and you can really see how the presence of Mao and Mao Zedong thought had become cultic and just sort of permeated everything in their thinking. You can see the kind of power that Mao had over young people at that time. And you can ask students what they think of these kinds of directives. What does it mean, this kind of language about, you know, here at the bottom of number 24, you landowners who still rode on the people's heads and drank the people's blood after the liberation, we order you bastards to hurry up and turn over all your private holdings to the state. In a socialist state, we absolutely cannot allow you vampires to exist. I think that would get students' attention. Wild Swans, some of you may know this memoir by Yung Chang from 1991. This little passage that we've included is about her father, who was an early member of the Communist Party, who was deeply persecuted during the revolution to the point where the family thought he was going insane. And it's just, I think, a very moving passage about the damage that the revolution did to individual people. But of course, those sorts of memoirs, which are so commonly known in the West, are nothing like the whole story. And this is an interview Primary Source actually did with a man named Charles Wang about how the revolution affected him as a rural villager. And this selection is really the selection from the perspective of someone whose life was changed in positive ways by the revolution. Maybe not exclusively positive ways, but this is someone who never would have gotten schooling without the creation of a village school. He became a teacher in the village school. He was enabled to go to university, and he's now very successful in a larger town near his village, where he sends a lot of money back to his village. So he says, I benefited from the Cultural Revolution as well. And that's a perspective that doesn't always make it, I think, into our consciousness of the Cultural Revolution in the West. And of course here, this is a peasant's reflection on Mao from the early 1980s, as well as a photograph of the line at Mao's mausoleum in Tiananmen Square, where people are waiting to see what he looked like in death. But I think this kind of source is very important. And we have tried hard to include sources from different sectors and different parts of the Chinese population, from peasants to soldiers to students to scholars to governmental and party elites, because all of those perspectives are part of the bigger story that helps us to discern what's going on in China today. So Mao had wealth and greatness written all over his face, the look of a real emperor, but he was better than an emperor. He was the savior of the poor from the moment he was born. So those, those are the kinds of pairings that I think really get students thinking and asking questions and having a jumping off point to search for more information. I'll just say that the companion volume to this chronologically organized volume is The Enduring Legacy of Ancient China, and this is a thematically organized book for those who teach ancient and traditional China. It has materials on arts and building projects and Silk Road and those sorts of topics, sort of more World History 1 content or even elementary school content. Also published by Chung and Sui, our publishers. And then I'll just end with this. If you're interested in learning more, we have created 8-week online courses on modern China and also on ancient China that come with these source books. Or you can buy them directly from Chung and Sui at the links that are provided here. And Jennifer is linking those in the chat room if you just want to go in and take a peek as we wrap up. But now I want to stop talking and leave some time for your questions or comments, whatever you like. I've been just absolutely blitzing you with information. So are there things you'd like to know more about or that you're wrestling with as you embark on teaching some topics like this? Feel free to raise your hand, and we'll just enable you to say your question for the group, or type your question right into the chat box at the left and just hit enter, and it will come to us, and then I can address it directly. What is the average reading level of your background readings? That's a great question, Lisa. It ranges a bit. We've tried to really aim it. The sources really vary. I think there's some sources that would actually be accessible to elementary school children, particularly some of the more visual ones. But the main reading level, I would say, is high school, and you would need to simplify some of the sources a little bit or excerpt them more heavily if you were working with 7th graders, say. But I would say it's mostly pitched at a 9 to 11 reading level. Anything else from people? Anybody want to raise a brave hand and speak out loud, or just type your question in? There are, I believe that on Amazon you can look at the source books and you can actually go in and flip through a number of pages and just do some exploring on your own if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the reading level and thinking about whether your students could handle it. There is a whole chunk of a chapter right in Amazon that you can explore online. A question from Megan. Does the source book focus on women or Confucianism in great detail? There are many, many sources by and about women in the book. We've made it a point. Many of the people putting this book together are women, and we, of course, wanted to include women's voices as such an important part of the history. So you will see women poets from the early Qing dynasty, and you will see women's memoirs and diary entries from Tiananmen. They're really sort of interspersed throughout the book, the perspectives of women. There isn't a chapter that's called Women in Modern China because it's not a thematically organized book. It's really more of an integrated perspective. Confucianism appears mainly in the chapters about education and the exam system, and Confucian values are referenced in a number of parts of the book. However, for the actual school of Confucianism, that is in the prior source book. That's in The Enduring Legacy of Ancient China. There's a whole chapter on Confucianism there and a chapter on other Chinese belief systems like Taoism and legalism and those philosophical sources about early China are in the prior source book. This source book only has the legacies of those systems embedded in it. Suggested documentaries or videos to help supplement the topics. Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question, because the additional resources provided by the source book and put together by Jennifer Hansen herself are a really important part of the chapters. There are, for every chapter, book listings, video listings, and website listings. And documentaries are included in film listings for chapters that are, on modern enough topics that you can have documentaries. So yes, there are many, many supplementary resources, and those are the resources I mentioned earlier that we will continue to update and the links that we'll continue to check. But there are the Chinese film industry and the Western film industry have both created amazing documentaries and feature films about modern China, and we would love for you to know about all the good stuff that's out there. So that part of our book includes all of that. How different is this edition from your previous edition? Becky asks. Another really great question. I was a co-editor for the new edition, so I spent a great deal of time with the old edition, and it is significantly different in a few key ways. One of the ways is that Unit 5, the last 4 chapters of the book, are very substantially changed. The contents of the background essays are rewritten. The sources have been added to and updated with a lot of new sources that didn't appear in the first editions. We've corrected minor matters of accuracy or updated things where historians' interpretations have been changing about topics like the Great Leap Forward and about the Cultural Revolution. I would say the chapter about early communist rule, chapter 13, is very dramatically different than in the first edition, and chapter 14 on the Cultural Revolution is fairly different than in the first edition. The other things that we've done for all chapters is we've rewritten the voice of the book so that it addresses students directly and kind of lets them know what they would need to do in a particular activity, so that the kind of tone of the activities section of the book is changed. We've also tried to vary the pedagogy of the activities more. As a co-editor, I felt like the original activities were very kind of read and discuss based, and that is extremely important that kids be able to do, but there are many, many different ways to tackle that. So along with Carolyn Platt, the other co-editor of the new edition, who as a teacher and very experienced educator, we recrafted many of the activities to really, I think, model more interesting and engaging pedagogy. And of course we updated all of the resources. So there are new things that have come out, there are new things that we've discovered and that teachers have told us about. I would say that, probably a fifth to a quarter of the contents of the book are very different than what they were. Almost every chapter was revised by a scholar. The chapter background essays, of the 20 of them, about 15 of them were significantly revised. Does anyone have any other questions about the resource or about teaching with primary sources on China? These are all great questions, and we've enjoyed having you very much today. I hope that you find good resources. I hope that we can be helpful in that process, and please do feel free to keep in touch with us and to become part of our regular newsletter postings, or follow us on Twitter or Facebook. And we would love to support you in any way that we can as you create new curriculum or even new courses on China. Thank you so much.